A very good afternoon to one and all. We begin our second session in the series of dialogue series of Mysore School of Architecture. Myself, Sapna Shivakumar, my colleagues Zara and Surabhi, all of us have interest in the field of urban planning and urban design. And when Professor Sandeep and Professor Mahant approached us to do a session on something concerned with urban design, we were wondering what is that we can share on a common platform. And one of the things that we said is all of us will present to you all what we did as part of our master's program or research program. And somewhere all this led to the public spaces. And all of us, being from Mysore, have worked with the city of Mysore. So what we are going to put forward to you is different perspectives of looking at urban spaces, and the case that we will take up is that of Mysore. So I will go first, and after me will be Zara, because both of us are looking at these public spaces at a macro level, and Surabhi will go in later because hers is a more intimate and smaller scale study of the spaces. So I'll just start sharing. When I started to think about the topic for my thesis in my MArch of urban design, there was this space, rather large physical element of the Mysore city, which always intrigued me, which was the Chamundi Hill. And I wanted to do something concerned with the Chamundi Hill. One was the hill in itself, and also the settlement that is on top of the hill. So how I went about it was the whole, is going to be the story for your next 15 minutes. And what happens when you are studying urban spaces or urban morphology and all, is that originally there is a land that exists. There is a topography, there is a certain surface drainage and water systems that exist. And based on top of that is what man builds. So there is a system that exists naturally and the systems that man builds on top of it. As long as there is harmony between this natural and built systems, everything is fine. When there is a mismatch between the two, then only things get haywire. I guess this should be better. Yeah. So what the image that you're seeing is the Manhattan Creek. It's an artist's impression of what it might have been thousands of years ago and what man has converted it into now. So about Mysore, I had to go through the phases of development. Like all of us know, there was first only the city and the fort, and then there was a burning of the palace, which made the kings took this as an opportunity and moved out the common people into the 7 mohallas, and how it grew over a period of time. But always there was this physical entity. To limit the growth of Mysore city, there were two main physical entities. One was the KRS, Krishnarajasagar Reservoir, which was a huge thing. Beyond that, the city couldn't grow. There were the greener fields and all that. And on the other side, there was the Chamundi Hill. Okay, so that sort of limited the boundaries of the city for a for a long period of time. And I went through the comprehensive development plans of Mysore city and how it had changed over a period of time. And 2011 CDP, what it did was, it was showing that there was going to be a ring road and it is going to go around the Chamundi Hill, which was a very important decision. And whether it was to be or not to be, that was a big question, and how one had to look at it. So Chamundi Hill being the case, one had to look at what is Chamundi Hill to Mysore city. Historically, Mysore has got its very name from Mahishasura or Mahishasuru, Mahisuru, and it is this Chamundi Hill that is there. It mythology says that it is nothing but this demon who had fallen down after being slain by Chamundi. And so, if you see the hill from one side, it looks like a person, a huge human being fallen down. There is a very clear demarcation of the head, the torso, and the legs. So that's how important it is. There is the temple that is there, physically and geographically, because it is a high point near a flat land. Most places of Mysore many places of Mysore have got a vision of this particular hill that exists. From lots of places in Mysore, you can see this and you identify yourself. In the world famous Dasara, this sort of forms a canvas for the display of the welcome sign. And ecologically, what it is, it's a habitat to more than 600 species of plants and birds and butterflies, and even the plant forms. There are lots of species of that. So it ranges from little birds to even the leopard. Socially and culturally, the temple that is there is a very important this one for the deity. Originally, the Shiva temple that is there, or the Mahabaleshwar temple that is there on the top of the hill, is much older than the Chamundi Hill, Chamundeshwari temple. But after the Mysore, the Wadiyars of Mysore patronized and accepted Lord Chamundi as their deity and their home deity, it gained more prominence, and lots of the cultural festivals and everything begins from here. In fact, the Mysore Dasara also symbolically begins with prayers that is offered to the goddess. Socially, apart from this cultural aspect of it, lots of people traverse the steps. It has become an integral part of the exercise regime of so many people. The youth always like to go to the Chamundi Hills for the spectacular view of the city that comes from, that one gets to see from there. So it's a very important part of Mysore. Now, when I took up the topic, somebody said, how can this be an urban design project? But Chamundi Hill is so much part of Mysore and so much part of a public space of Mysore city that it does get qualified for an urban public space, because the people are using it for so many things. There is also the part of nature treks and all that happen here. So that is how important it is to the city of Mysore and the people of Mysore. What is worrisome in the newer times is that with technology and all, man had learned to circumvent so many physical restrictions, and this being a boundary of the city at one point of time, later on with all the policies and all that coming in, it started being engulfed by the city. And this had got a lot of implications. Okay, and what to do with this so that all the ecological functions, the culture, the history, everything can be protected was the main aim of the whole study. When I was looking at this, there's so many things. I always say urban design is like, there's a lot of analysis to it. A common friend always gives an analogy saying that, why do we do so many studies in urban design? He gives an analogy with doctors and medicine. He says there are so many, you go to a doctor, he's the best of oncologists. You go to him with a wound, and he, by looking at it, he knows it is a malignant tumor. But what will he do? He will give you a series of tests, because if he tells you straight away, you won't take it in the right spirit. No, I mean, you will say, who are you? Are you God? If you just see it, will you know? No, he will prescribe so many tests for you and all that. So all these surveys and analysis that you do is like these tests that one does for to get diagnosed. So there is this diagnosis that happens. And when I was going through my literature studies, I came across this book called Design with Nature by Ian McHugh. That was the premise for my study, and that is how it gave me a basis to go on further with it. Because looking at just the hill settlement in isolation would not be doing full justice to the whole public realm. So Ian McHugh talks about lots of analysis of layers, macro level analysis of the topography, the geology, the hydrology. So that being the case where in Chamundi Hill is all these hills are like a sponge. So when it rains, they absorb the thing, and there were lots of these little lakes. And I came across one 1914 map which showed the natural drainage pattern which was around, and the number of lakes and kattes, smaller points that were there, had reduced to almost 30% of what was there in 1914. So why? Because of unthought of and unplanned development that was happening. So I had to do a study of that, and then the geology, what it was, how old the rock was, and all that. So these are the layers that one had to study in order to understand the ecosystem better. Then there was the vegetation mapping and the vegetation analysis. Secondary data from this one called Biodiversity of Chamundi Hill by one Professor Sadanand and Shiv Prasad was available on the net, which told me about what is the kind of vegetation that is there, scrub forest, dense forest, and thick vegetation. Here, this the Chamundi Hill forest comes into something called social forestry, and it is protected that way. Now you can see that they are trying to fence it also. And the last but not the least was the wildlife and this one mapping, wherein we looked at what are the low value habitats, what are the medium value habitats, and the high value habitats on this hill. It was home to so many things like the wild boar, the mongoose, the leopard, many types of birds, and all that. And the other interesting thing was earlier, I mean, on a macro level scale, we did a study of these wildlife sanctuaries. And because there are these green corridors which makes sort of connects these sanctuaries from one to another, and it provides for movement of the wild animals from one to another. And because of this unplanned development of places, what is happening is each of those habitats is getting cut off, and it is remaining restricted. And that is where this man and animal conflict comes from. So that was one of the findings also. McHugh's analysis looks at all these layers in parallel, and that was what was looked at. There are the different activities that were happening on the hill, and what was the effect and impact of that, whether it was positive or negative, and whether it could be regulated or not. If it could be regulated, what could be the remedial measures? That was the step-by-step analysis that one had to undergo. Then one finding was that because of the vehicular movement and because of this very popular tourist and pilgrimage place that is there on top of the hill, there was a lot of land that was being cleared for parking. Okay, and so there was a lot of study done into that, and this was seen as not a very good thing for the ecosystem of the hill. Very fact that there were so many vehicles coming up and down the hill every day, and a large part of this whole forest was being cleared for what? To create parking. So could that be regulated, or if it could be, then what could the regulate measures be? Yes, next was the effect of tourism on this place and how it could be made sustainable. There was something called carrying capacity. Carrying capacity, tourism carrying capacity, it talks about when there is a large influx of people, there is a lot of pressure on the infrastructure. That many people, for how long do they occupy this place? We found by a study that minimum 3 hours is what an average tourist spends here. Okay, and for between that time, would he need water? Would he need loose? Would, I mean, how much he would dirty it, so that the solid waste, how it could be managed? All these things we did a study of. Number of people and which times of the year, how many people come? Is there a certain time of the year when many more come, and is there a time when lesser people come? What are the kind of tourist influx? How many are coming only as tourists? How many are coming as pilgrims to see the temple, visit the temple? And how many are the locals who are coming, just for an evening to enjoy the site? And then we also looked at the tourist circuit that is there in Mysore. And we found that Chamundi Hill is a must do for all tourist circuits, and nobody leaves this out. So that sort of a thing. And by what vehicles do most people come? We found that this is part of that pilgrim circuit. During December, there is a surge in the December, January, there's a surge in the number of tourists that visit. We said that the reason for this being, this is a part of the circuit of pilgrims going to Sabarimala. So that also were kept into account. What are the different types of vehicles that they come in? How much time they do they spend on the hill? All these were looked at. And when you talk about carrying capacity, what sort of development? You can go way ahead, which will disturb the nature, or it can be absolutely nothing. Like in Bhutan, they have got some places that are of tourist importance. They have not done anything to improve it, because their ideology is the more difficult it is for people to go, the less number of people will go there and the less pollution will happen. So are we looking at that sort of development, or are we looking at the absolute other end of it? But what is important is to create, find that balance in between. Okay, so this was also looked at. And finally, there was a conclusion. What are the different aspects and the function of the hill, and what is the impact of the disturbance that all this has created on each of these things? And of course, there was always the settlement on top, which had in 2011, when I did this study, it had a population about 2,500 people who were living there. And so how the settlement developed, typical studies that we do for a settlement study were done. And the other layers of this one, how was the land use, how it has changed, what is the ownership, the demographics, the heights of the buildings, all that was studied. Also the age and condition, because you are looking, yes, at the religious precinct, but at the same time, one has to look at the 2,000 plus people who live there also. What is their way of living? There is a restriction. You and I can't go up Chamundi Hill and buy a plot and build. Okay, that sort of restriction is there. But still within themselves, their population is growing, and the lands of theirs. How does one look at, trying to regulate the development on that hill? Now, that was also thought of. Then the urban form of it, one had to study how it was just in the temple area, in the residential area. They had certain, very vernacular, this one sort of streets, all that. Plus there was the main Rajabidi, which had all these other fairly larger buildings that were associated with the temple activities. There was an analysis done of the street character, different places, what is the street character. and also of the typology of buildings, the residential buildings that were there. Then one can just not leave out the amenities and infrastructure, and for everything, the analysis that was done, tourist facilities as per standards, what it should be, what is existing, so how much is the shortfall. So in the design proposal and all that, we had to look for making these things. Finally, after all this macro and micro level studies, one came up with the design proposal of the urban design framework. So what was the conclusions is, I came up with something called the Chamundi Hill Conservation Plan, and there were 4 zones. The first one, which is there in the center, I hope you can see my cursor, that is there, that is the heritage zone. The next one, the next one, which is in the dark green, we had proposed a reserve forest in that zone. And next there was the core conservation site of the hill. Okay. And the last one was the peripheral area conservation zone, which was beyond the hill. So this was also very important. So we looked at all these. On top, there were 2-3 lakes, especially there was one, the Devi Kere, and one more, this one, wherein because of the activities that were happening on the hill, the religious activities, one of the lakes was absolutely contaminated. So revival of that was also one of the parts. And the other thing was, the conclusion was that the vehicular interference that happened because of these 1,000, 2,000 odd vehicles going up and down the hill during the peak seasons, even more. And the very fact that lot of land was being cut off and being used for parking, one came up with the proposal that there can be a transit terminal and parking at the foothills, and from here they would have electric bus loops which would go back and forth. The larger premise to this was, there is the tourist circuit that happens in Mysore. The same vehicles in which the tourists come need parking place at the zoo, they need parking place at Philomena's, they need Philomena's church, they need parking place at the exhibition grounds, they need parking place at Chamundi Hills. So why not have some sort of a transit terminal wherein the parking happens there, and then there are also other facilities for the tourists and all, and from there you will just have the electric buses doing the loop. You know, it will have a 5-minute interval, 10-minute interval and all that, so that the pressure on the land on top is reduced. Okay, so this was the other thing. And the last thing that was proposed was, we saw a lot of danger of having this ring road going around the thing. What happens is, when there is a road, there are layouts, and when there are layouts, the residences come in and they sort of encroach on the foothills of the this Chamundi. And so one of the proposals was, but then connectivity also becomes important. So one of the proposals was to have, or even a flyover, thing on top, so that only at strategic points you have got take what is this, clovers that have transit this one. But then that portion did not really work, and the government went ahead and they did it the way they have done it now. So this was how the proposal was given. And then for the religious precinct on top, we gave another proposal for making it a little more clutter free, and the queuing complex, and giving a defining a proper entry with a small kund which was supposed to take in rainwater harvested, this one. And also we linked through a walkway, a shaded walkway, this dirty lake which we had proposed will be rejuvenated. And the other proposals about amenities and surface treatment. The other thing was the amount of roads that we had and the amount of asphalting that happened, it did not give scope for the rainwater to be absorbed. So there were proposals that were given for surface treatment and how to catch the this water on the drain and take it off to these catchment bunds. Then also propose certain urban design guidelines. So what could be the public facilities, how could the seating be, how could the gardens and all that be, what sort of bollards, and to sort of regulate the urban fabric. There was a color palette that was suggested, and then integration of things like solar powered lights, and then how to look at the hill itself, creation of swales and bunds to take the water and through the drainage patterns, the surface drainage patterns that were originally existing, and trying to recreate those ponds and lakes that had dried off. The stakeholders here were the village panchayat, the Chamundi of Chamundi Hill village, the MUDA, the tourism department and forest department and all, and of course the temple authority, which is the Muzirai. And we said that project implementation could be through a special purpose vehicle, which is called the Chamundi Hill Conservation Task Force, which would be there only for the period of this thing, and that's how it would be taken forward. So this in short was the whole study and the proposal that was given as a framework and some of the urban design guidelines. So that sort of finishes what I had to say about public space making on a large scale. Now here the public space is not just the temple or this one, it is the entire hill, because it has some sort of function that it is serving to the people of the city, and also for people who are not from the city, from outside, that is the tourists and the pilgrims. I will now call upon Zara to take up her topic, which I think she's talking about different ways of looking at aesthetics of a city through its public spaces. What we will do is, after all three of us finish our presentations, we'll open the floor to any questions that any of you have, and we can have a dialogue that way. Over to you, Zara.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah. In continuation of ma'am's discussion, good afternoon, everybody. I would just like to have a small discussion about my master's thesis, which was relatively similar. It was on the basis of, built on the basis of urban aesthetics, but here totally looked into the planning factors for a small city like Mysore. Because before I get into it in detail, I would just like to give you certain glossary, which as normal students would basically read about in any presentation. So, okay. So first thing that I'm looking at is natural elements. So when I say natural elements, it's basically anything which is derived from nature. Built elements having a physical shape. So I'm basically talking about a relationship between both natural as well as built, and then considering them with respect to a common factor, that is aesthetics. Aesthetics is an appreciation which is relative to beauty and taste. So there are certain principles that we look at when it comes to planning, and planning is basically the process of thinking. So we are looking at a thinking process with respect to both natural and built spaces in terms of aesthetics. Another thing that we will also be looking at are spaces which are urban and spaces which are public. Spaces which are urban are actual physical enclosures which focus on activities such as squares, streets, parks, stretches of coastline, rivers, etc. You can add on many other physical enclosures. So these are basically features which are brought in with respect to a boundary, and then we are not concentrating on the boundaries but concentrating on the activities which are happening within. So these within the boundary activities are called as urban spaces, and public spaces are spaces which are publicly owned or which are of public use, accessible and enjoyable for all. It's free and it's without a profit motive. So when there's a profit motive coming into pictures, and then there is no relation to a public space being enjoyed by all. Next thing that I would look at is I have considered the same city of Mysore which ma'am showed. So before I get into it, I have looked into Mysore with respect to its ethnicity, its physical growth, its a way of looking at formal aesthetics, evolutionary aesthetics, ecological aesthetics, as well as cultural aesthetics. So I'm looking at 4 basic factors. And aesthetics is not a new term. Aesthetics has always been in terms of town planning also. If you actually look at it right from the towns like Greece and Rome. So everything had a principle of beauty, everything had a taste. And all of them had come into the picture with respect to a certain relevance to a certain point. So now, on the same basis, I actually studied a lot of old cities all around, like Chicago, Burnham, even Brasilia and all that. And I saw that there was a certain type of growth that was noticed in the kind of deciphering a city with respect to its various layers. Likewise, I started looking at Mysore also with respect to its built elements and the non-built elements. Then when I saw that basically Mysore has a growth factor which has come with respect to the restoration process done by the Wadiyars. So this was done in 4 stages. One stage is called as the Mysore, which was restored right after Tipu Sultan's rule, when it came into the Wadiyars' rule from 1799 to the rendition period in 1881. After which it was post-rendition period. Then there was a rapid growth happening in Mysore from around 1903 to at least 1947. So you see a lot of modernization there. You see a lot of buildings come in there, and a lot of growth happened with respect to aesthetics. After which it was the post-independence period from 1947 to date. Before I get into it, I would also like to talk to you about the various factors which actually were prevalent in Mysore. One, as ma'am mentioned, is Chamundi Hill. Chamundi Hill is one of the basic factor upon which Mysore began sprawling, Mysore began its growth. And other than this, the other artificial sectors, but considered as natural sector because they were developed by the Wadiyars. There were 6 lakes which were developed all around the city: Karanji, Kukkarahalli, Lingabuddhi, Dalvoy, Bogadi, and Devanur Lake. So these are the almost like current pictures, of which the 5 are almost there, but the 6th one is almost dead. With it, I would also tell you that when I started appreciating the city with respect to its each layer, then I saw that Mysore, if you actually look at it in a Google image, you see that this is a palace, and around it are all these lakes which I just showed you, which have been located all around a particular axis, with the Chamundi Hill coming and sitting at the lower right hand corner. And then there were lakes which were there. Most of them were man-made. The Zoological Garden, Brindavan Gardens, which was again man-made. It is considered as a tourist spot today. And there were around 6% of parks. Okay. And this is like a living example of history for what we are going to appreciate in a city with a lot of layers. Along with it, we have a lot of trees here. The kind of trees that we have here are totally different. A whole study can be made with respect to its appreciation. Then along with it, we also saw that there were certain built elements. Either there would be heritage elements or image elements. Image elements like landmarks, edges, districts, paths, and nodes like the Kevin Lynch's image of the city. Focal elements like circles, focus, clock towers, statues, precinct squares, and there were various other styles and buildings which came up, like mansions, residences. There were quarters which were dedicated to a certain section of the society, and they were given as the city developed in its growth. Along with it, there were a lot of public offices also, which were again put forward with a lot of understanding of the city's layers. So these are just certain images which I have got from online. Basically, what you see here are all these small things which I just spoke about when they came into the picture. That's the Lansdowne building and the Fountain Circle, which is currently housed near the Central Jail. This was a compound of the Mysore Palace when it actually was the only structure when Mysore came into picture, with a lot of shady hills there. The towers, then these small palaces which came up with the lakes, man-made lakes. And today what we see is a total different picture in contrast, because we have started developing around it. We have started working around the same appreciation below the older cover. So when I started conceding it to critique the city as an aesthetic artifact, I saw that Mysore, if we actually look at any kind of an analogy of architecture, we see that everything has two different axes. One is a horizontal axis and the other is a vertical axis. So I started looking at the city as a whole at a planner's level with respect to the horizontal axis first. So when I read what actually comes under the horizontal axis, the first thing is domains. Domains in the sense physical domains, tacit domains, and narrative domains. So I saw that when you look at the whole zoning of Mysore, if this is considered as Mysore, Mysore actually is in between two barriers. One is a built barrier, which is the KRS reservoir, and the other is a natural relief. So in between this is the city which is lying at its house. The next domain was how it grew. As I told you, Mysore in the beginning was just the fort with its walls and a couple of residences around the fort. And then, as ma'am said in her talk, that all these houses were all shifted later after a fire here, and a plague broke down. And so what happened was, palace was an individual unit, a temple came in, and a lot of residences came up after the palace or beyond the palace. Likewise, the city also slowly started growing, and what we see today is we have three different boundaries. The first boundary is actually dictated under the bylaws of the Mysore City Corporation. The second boundary is under the MUDA, and then we also have the actual territory of Mysore, or the boundary, the external boundary, which is actually bringing in all the other taluks of Mysore. So this is what we see today, right from just being from the fort to what it has grown today. And then when I actually saw the vertical axis here, vertical axis is basically when we are looking at it through various strategies like time, origin, scale, its form, etc., etc. So I started looking at them with respect to each of the strategies, and I saw when time is considered as a whole, time started whirling faster, and Mysore began its origin from Chamundi Hill, and then its origin slowly started shifting all the way from the hill to the palace. And today our main focus in the city is all about Ambavilas Palace. So the shift, the displacement of origin began. And then from Srirangapatna to Mysore, so even the construction started shifting, the buildings started shifting, the kind of spaces which began with respect to its origin also started shifting right from the historical town of Srirangapatna to Mysore. So this was like a displacement of origin, which we actually notice when we start considering the artifact as a city. Next thing is transposition of scale. This I just considered at a particular street in Mysore, which is the Ashoka Road. You can see the clock tower there. So with the Ashoka Road skyline, I also considered the town hall and its skyline with respect to the clock tower. And then I saw that there was a transposition of scale there. If you actually look at the commercial fabric here, there's a mixed use transformation. The palace and the town hall buildings basically have this particular slope, which I actually notice. So this is the town hall and that's the palace. So you actually see this slope. But when it comes to a skyline, when compared to the tower, the clock tower, you see that the transposition suddenly increased. So there was a distortion with respect to its form also. So if you notice, I just try to see as to if there was a particular angle to the tower, what would happen and how would it grow. So I started looking at it with respect to various forms to actually understand what are the different other ways in which Mysore must have grown. We also see a lot of addition of forms or additive transformation of forms, which began with slowly adding of various forms when it came into picture, a building coming into picture. So this was like molding each of the shape and putting them all together to actually get what we today call it as the Indo-Saracenic style of the city. So we got various skylines when it came to the temple or to the palace and all. So these outlines also were very operational and were considered as with respect to each of the building and its skyline. Then scale was considered. This was in relation to any religious structure or any public space. So they always wanted to build buildings which were actually magnitude in scale. So such buildings came in where scales, if you look at a human scale, you see they were 1:5 or 1:10 times the height of a human. So, and also the use and coordination of colors that came in. So all these things actually added on to the whole concept of the city being an artifact. Then I started looking at the space with respect to how it is today in terms of its characters. So when we see the characters, we see that if we just look at the city with its boundaries and see how the residences are put in, we see that that's the palace. So this is an enclosed zone. Then you have an unenclosed tourist zone. So both of them are touristy spaces. Then we have a lot of commercial zones there, hospitals coming around them, certain residences which have grown as the city grew, and kind of a diffused, undefined green space, which is the hills, the Chamudi Hill. So then I started again looking at them with respect to how the whole system has come up when the city started growing. Right from the Brown system. Brown system is the drainage that I'm looking at, the actual drainage which began from the focus. Considering my focus to be the Ambavilas Palace now. Okay, so I see that the drain of Mysore is on all the four sides almost, and they have drained towards either of the sides. And when you look at the blue system, all the lakes have also come up at a particular range. So there are these concentric circles upon which the city lakes have also been come up. This is the palace, and with respect to that, when I started plotting up all the blue systems, that is the lakes, the existing lakes, we see that there was a clear understanding of putting them all across the city, and it was not just put up randomly. Green system also came in, like I haven't included all the parks, but most of the important parks have been included here along with the Chamudi Hill zone. So this is the green system we see. So green is totally towards the right here, and then towards the left, we do not see much of green. So possibly that's the reason why most of the parks that are coming up in Vijayanagar in this kind of a region are having larger parks and open areas rather than this particular or the olden part of the city, because this has already been thought of with respect to its derivation of the system. And then also with it, I also realized that all the palaces that have come up, again in consideration with Ambavilas Palace only, are on the same basis. So you see that there is a particular direction upon which they have decided that there should be a unidirectional or a multi-directional view when you look at or when you get a view from the particular palace there. So other than the Rajendra Vilas Palace, most of the palaces of Mysore, we know that there are 7 palaces in Mysore. Most of the palaces, the 6 palaces are almost on the same line. So there's an axis which has been developed upon which the the plotting of the palaces has come up. And then how have we utilized them spatially? Spatially, when we look at Mysore, we see that today we see that there are all these old residences which are here, the mohallas, then a transportation access which has come up, that's the suburb bus stand, city bus stand, the railway line and all that. And then along with it have these lakes also interpose themselves. So there's a kind of a loop with respect to each of its development when Mysore was growing. So all these things were kept in mind while they were actually being worked on. Okay, when we come further down onto how exactly these mohallas came into picture, we see that this is the palace, and then all the mohallas have come all around the palace with respect to a certain meaning again. The palace and the surrounding areas were basically for a particular ethnic group, and then as the need of the ethnic society began, the kings also started deciding to allot the areas with respect to each of their profession. So if you see the behavioral pattern, this is from one of the sources in Star of Mysore, where I saw that most of the names of the streets also have a relevance with respect to how people were practicing their businesses there. And with respect to it, even their names are relative to it. And then when we look at enclosures, we basically see that the enclosures are also having a lot of hierarchy with respect to the Agrahara style, or the way the small KT streets came up, the commercial streets came up. And then later on, as the city developed and how we started beginning to work on their taxonomies further, we see that the hierarchy has almost remained the same with respect to how each of the buildings face each other on a street. So with this in mind, I actually saw that there was a lot of appreciation which came forward for Mysore's style of growth. And then on the same basis, I've also kind of concluded, if in case we would like to see certain more appreciative layers to Mysore, we can actually decide or give certain solutions to the city with respect to this. So one is having a bicycle parking from the main thoroughfares, so people start depending on such kind of vehicles. Then we can have a single kind of color coding and maintaining a single structure for all the signages which are at least in the CBD area. Or we can also have a separate Tonga or a bicycle or battery vehicle ride lane. So the vehicles move in one lane and the other vehicles decide to choose the others. We encourage street art to grace up the otherwise sleepy streets. And during Dasara, when Devarajas Road is basically having a lot of preference in the city. So if we kind of give the same kind of color coding with street furniture and all, how would the city look? And then also with respect to crafting the residential layouts with wider streets, local street furniture, and utilizing all that we have with respect to developing the city. Along with it, stop up any kind of street vandalism right at its baby steps and try to understand why this is happening, so we can actually give certain proposals to the government to actually preserve the environment as well as the character of the old city. Along with it, I've also looked into various changes that we see with respect to an urban planning perspective when it comes to changes for a historic city. Initially, what we see is regular city, as we see for a city like Mysore, we see everything had a vistaed view. So considering the same thing, we can establish a vistaed view creation ordinance to conserve magnificent vistaed views. We have the palaces there, we have the lakes there. So if we actually start broadening them with respect to the same perspective, how do we actually preserve aesthetics? And then also, if we are trying to work on the new buildings, what exactly should be kept in context as a town planner when we actually compliance with rules and regulations? So we have to basically look at certain things like heights, building heights, the design of the buildings, outdoor advertisement, historical streets, surrounding scenery, and vista views. And considering all of them along with the support system, which is the bylaws, we have to make laws so that we do not lose the unison at which the city has grown further. Along with it, I also looked into various policies that we can see with respect to new policies to develop the city only based on aesthetic characteristics. And I also saw that as Mysore has a very defined skyline, we can actually look at it with respect to it being very poetic and start developing it as our own duty and responsibility, because we've inherited it and it's our duty now to suit the city with respect to its policies and maybe encourage a kind of diversity with respect to unifying design with respect to all public spaces. I think that is it. With this, I thank you all. I'm done with the presentation. I think Surabhi can begin.
Right. So this was my thesis topic for my master's in urban design. So it was reinvigorating social spaces through tactical urbanism. So before I even began my study towards my topic, I started looking at what exactly was a city, how did it begin in general. So there is this person, Lewis Mumford. So based on his writings, what I figured was that the city began to exist as a gathering space initially, mostly for mutual relations and other spiritual communication, political communication. So basically it was more of a congregation space rather than what we have today, we have spaces, a lot of spaces for trading, and then we have the main pathways that lead us there, that is the street network. So ideally a city, how it started was people started gathering together, and that was the city's greatest function. So then I started looking at how cities began to develop. So according to the UN in the 2007 revision, it said that 2008 was the year that was first time in human history when most of the population were going to be living in the cities. And 2030, almost about 5 billion people would have been living in the cities. It's not that the people are moving, but it's also that the cities are definitely growing and encroaching, or rather, I would say, getting amalgamated, many villages getting amalgamated to form larger cities. So ideally, if we are rich or we are poor, it doesn't matter, but most of us will be born, we'll live, and we'll die in cities. So the concept or the ideology in which this city's amalgamation is taking place, that truly dictates as to how we spend our social lives in the city. That is where we gather, where we meet our friends, how we travel to work, and other day-to-day. So how people gather. So what is this gathering area or the thing called? It's basically the social realm. Once you step out of your house or once you step out of the workplace and get into the larger picture of the city. So I started understanding that, and to try and understand what exactly is social, how much is social. So this is a very basic concept as to when you meet a person on a social scale, what would be the distance? On a personal scale, what would be the distance? And then finally you have, and on an intimate scale, what is, the basic measurements that are required. So then this also helps to get a little idea as to when people gather, like if you say 100 people are gathering, so what would be the average space that is required? So again, thinking about it on a city level. So what happens? Why do we need this social connection? Right now, based on the current context or the current situation, we're all at home, we are all together with our families. But for many of us, that is not enough. We want to get out, we want to meet our friends, we want to meet our colleagues. So there is a reason why human beings are social animals. So what does social connections and happiness have to do with one another? One thing is that it gives us a sense of belonging. It gives us a sense of belonging to a group or a community. Also, there was certain studies that were done which says people are happier when they meet other people instead of, like what we're doing right now, social distancing and meeting online and things like that. So happiness is also contagious. It need not be that you meet a person or you talk to a person, but if there are a group of people that have a happier energy among them, and you just happen to be there or you happen to pass that area, so obviously that is sort of contagious, and then that gets on to you. So there is this study done by the psychologist. His name is James Fowler. So he took this data about 5,000 people, and over a couple of years, and found that happiness sort of benefits one another. It is contagious. So again, the positive effects of happiness from connecting with others are lasting. So this is something called hedonic adaptation. So this happens on a day-to-day basis as well. For example, if you buy a new laptop, so you are very happy and content with it for the first, couple of days or months or something like that. But then after a few weeks or something, you get adapted to the laptop. So there is nothing surprising about it. There is nothing positive about it for you anymore. So the same thing with our cities. What is the sort of surroundings that the city is providing you, or the local environment is providing to you, sort of dictates what sort of relationship you have with your city or the environment. So finally, this is from a book called The Happy City by Charles Montgomery. So he defines a healthy social network like a tree. So the most important relationships are at the heart of a tree. So that is where all the roots sort of meet and bunch up together, which holds the root and the tree as a whole together. And also the roots or the tip of the roots, he defines it as contacts of varying strengths and intensities. You need them. You need them to have a healthy social structure. So I would like to also talk about a small experiment that was done by John Helliwell. So this is called the trust question, to understand what is the broken social scene that was happening in today's context. So this experiment was done in Toronto, and what they did was they scattered around 100 wallets all around the public space, and then there were two types of surveys that were done. So one is the questionnaire survey, and they went around asking people that if you lost your wallet, are you going to find it, or are you going to get it back? And the other thing was they were checking how many people actually came and returned these wallets. So 25% of them agreed that they're going to get their wallet back, whereas 83 people said that no, we're not going to get it back. So what actually happened was the reverse. Most of the wallets were returned, and once they started analyzing as to why this was taking place, so it was mainly because not because of the absence of corruption or that the person is being honest in returning the wallet, but it was defined as more of an act of kindness. So an act of kindness for a complete stranger who you do not know them. So finally, after all the survey was done and put together, the findings were that our fellow citizens are most likely to return the wallets than to steal or mug or cheat somebody. So, which is why, again, considering like most of us or most of the people would say, okay, don't go out to a public space, you might lose this, you might be mugged, you might be robbed. But then that is not the case all the time. So finally, I started looking at, okay, if I am trying to connect a social space or a public space according to happiness and the type of psychological factors design can have on it. So I started looking at the bigger picture. What is a happy city? How can the entire city be happy? So the first thing is food, shelter, security, education, health, whatever. But then what more can be done? So this is again from the book by Charles Montgomery called The Happy City. So he says, if a city maximizes joy and minimizes hardship, leads towards health rather than sickness, and it has fair portions of spaces, service, mobility, and costs to all the people. And finally, the most strongest is that it builds bonds between families, friends, and also strangers. So there are three circles that are involved. So another thing that I stumbled across upon is that Bhutan was one of the first countries to sort of declare that instead of GDP, we're going to measure our country's growth in terms of gross national happiness. And this happened in 1972. So what were the parameters that sort of contributed to the gross national happiness? So there was education, there was health, there's community, there's good governance, there's a cultural resilience. What about the living standards? That is the work ethics, the type of environment that we're there. And finally, we're looking at what the environment has to do. Because as an urban designer, finally, I have that area where I can deal and sort of redevelop the environment, or recreate the environment so that it contributes in the happiness index of a city. So again, looking at the parameters that come under the environment, so there are 4 different parameters. So one thing is safety, then there's housing, transport, and the local environment. So I started looking at how the local environment can play quite a bit of a role in the happiness index. So again, happiness index is a term that can be said easily, but to understand what exactly is urban happiness. When you have a positive association towards a place or the people who live in it, and then you want to go back to that place to spend more time or to spend a longer period of time, so that space sort of induces happiness within you. So whether you show it joyfully, openly or not, but then you are going there over and over again for a reason. And also that particular space so strongly interweaves social, environmental, economic, and other factors that come in that are necessary for our basic lifestyles, needs, and habits. So again, what is the psychological aspect that all of these parameters have to build upon the happiness index? So finally, I came down to these aspects, that is the social well-being, or social well-being is again, it varies day to day, but then here we are looking at collective social well-being. So, and how the urban environment has an impact, and how we can build better places at all scales. So when Le Corbusier was designing cities, he had this huge model in front of him, and with a hand over that, and he used to say, okay, these spaces are dedicated to these. But what really matters to us as a human being is the human scale. So on day-to-day basis, what we experience and what we gather, the information, what is collected, stored, and what you want to get back to, like I spoke about in the urban happens, what we want to get back at is what we see at a human scale on a daily basis. Yes, I do agree that Sapna ma'am and Zara ma'am were speaking in their thesis projects, the larger aspect also plays a major role, or it provides space for these smaller aspects to come into picture. And then finally, what is the experience that all of these create together? So I came upon this concept called tactical urbanism. And this was started off by Mike Lydon and Anthony Garcia. So tactical urbanism is something that, as it mentions, it is a short-term action that is put forward in expectance of a long-term change. Okay, so it is basically a neighborhood building aspect, or something that is kind of missing in the planning aspect right now, but then it is a phased approach, and then you put it out in the long-term change, so that finally in the next planning planning situation, so these aspects are brought into picture, and then it is made as a more permanent solution. So these are the different ways in which tactical urbanism has been taking place right now. So there's something called as ad busting, chair bombing, guerrilla gardening, building a better block. Few of which I'll get into a little bit detail later. So this is the open street that took place in Minneapolis. We've also had open streets in Mysore. I think the past two Dasaras we've had open streets. So the reason why the concept of open streets started was that we have this era of motordom where automobiles have dominated over the streets. Like I said, Lewis Mumford said that the streets were also essentially a gathering space. Streets were where people came to socialize. So later on, then we have these automobiles coming into picture, and then finally that has taken over what is happening as streets. So when we talk of as a public space, we most often miss out that the street itself is a public space. So open streets are a way of reminding that, streets are also public spaces. The design of streets have to be better. They have to change to the better. So this is again a street that is converted into a whole pedestrian area for the weekend. And then all these little setups are done so that people can come, hang out, spend some time. So again, this is done on a weekend to weekend basis. Bogota is also a very nice example for how they take out the operation of cars for a whole day. And then this happens on a regular basis. So this is called a parklet. So this usually happens opposite restaurants or cafes. So what they do is from the parking space where the cars are parked, or about 4 to 6 cars are taken off, and then these parklets are installed. So this could be initially done with basic local materials available to instigate change. So once these things are put up, people are definitely going to bring out their food, start sitting and eating outside, and then we are developing the street as a public space. So all these can be added in the planning aspects while they design the streets itself. So they have to provide for these areas so that urban designers can take forward such designs and bring out the social realm. This is a very small project that was done by a student in Canada. So what he did was he started adding these signages, and at every corner of the block, so there were 4 signages, and they pointed out to each direction saying it's a 7-minute walk to this area, or it's a 33-minute walk to the other area. So this was much more convenient and much more ideal for people to relate to. What happened was, so overnight this was put up, and then people started using it in the morning. So as you can see, there are some QR code that can be scanned, and then people started scanning those codes so that they get this particular template, and they started doing it for their own area. So finally, the municipality, they were against it, they took it down, but in the end, finally, all the people got together, they protested against this, saying that we need this, what you're doing is not right. And finally, this was brought back in. So small ideas like this can change the urban environment. It can change the way you perceive your environment altogether. So again, the whole idea of tactical urbanism is to empathize on what is there, try and define the area in which you want to work at, ideate, create a prototype, like the parklet, for example, put it into test in a particular area, and then finally create the design for it. So how I started looking at my project was again in Mysore. So I'm not going to get into too many details of the mapping or the drawings, but just to give an idea as to what are the sort of spaces that can come about with through tactical urbanism. So I started studying all the year round what are the different public activities that happen in Mysore, and where is it that people actually gather. Finally came to a conclusion that most of the people gather in the heritage zones. That is where the highest footfall is. So again, in Mysore, it is divided into 3 zones, zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3, based on the landmark, based on the footfall and things like that. So this is what I started doing. So all this comes under zone 2. So this is the Devaraja's Road, and there is Bombay Tiffany's right there. So what I have tried to do is take off about 12 to 14 two-wheelers. So there's a two-wheeler parking there, and then add out a parklet. So we already see that, I mean, not now, before, yes, that a lot of people would bring their food outside. They're all sitting on the footpath. There's a lot of commotion there, and the pedestrians do not have enough space to walk. But what if there was a parklet? So how many more such places in the city can we have these little things installed? And why can't the planning, in the planning phase itself, such spaces be marked out so that we get the time to sort of rebuild and look at these spaces and create the social realm there? So similarly, I tried out something around the clock tower. So, so this is the Ashoka Road. Actually, it goes on this way. Further ahead straight, and then you have this street that sort of curves out to the to Gandhi Square. So ideally speaking, according to the traffic flow and the traffic movement, that particular street that which connects from right in front of the town hall to the Gandhi Square can be used as a public space. So what I've tried to do here is sort of merge both the streets, that is the town hall right here and the clock tower, and why not create a plaza or a little square where people can actually sit and enjoy and embrace the clock tower. Right now we just pass through it, we hardly even notice it, but you given the time and space, you actually install make quick installations, so people will start embracing what is there already in the city. And this is also a small intervention done right above, opposite the Woodland Theatre. So ideally, this is a curb extension. So there is the Rajkumar Park that is here, and the same footpath that is sort of extended. It's called the curb extension. And then again, a smaller square can be created there again so that people can actually pause. So right now it's just more like a parking lot, and it's a chaos at the moment. Speaking about smaller scales, proposals can be to such a small scale, like what is used here are actually milk crates. And this is right opposite the Hotel Metropole. What we see there is most of, if we look at our transportation network, most of our, the buses that go to Mangalore and that go towards Bangalore and Nanjangud also as well, a lot of them have stops here. So there is a lot of physical gathering of people happening there, but with no facilities. So something that is so simple, if it's installed, if it's prototyped and tested, if we could do a little bit of surveys. So then from this survey, we can go on further to the planning department or the MODA or whatever and show them that, you know, this is what is needed here. We have already tried and tested it. So in this way, tactical urbanism helps out the planning process. And for the future, again, it helps giving out or assigning particular spaces where you can idealize for future urban design at smaller scale. So that's about it. So I hope, this helped you to give an idea as to how we can build spaces at all scales. When we say urban design, we mostly think of the larger aspect, but we can also look at the smaller aspects. Over to you, Sapna ma'am.
Thank you, Surabhi. That was nice. One thing that I would, take from your this one is most of these urban design projects, many a times they have to be carved out. They don't come to you on a platter. You do your studies and all that, and you try and convince the decision makers that such a project is important and it will contribute in a great manner to the better of the city. And that's how projects are carved out. If anyone has anything to say, then yes, sir. Ramkrishna Rao, sir, you can unmute yourself and then you can talk.
Thank you, Professor Sapna, Surabhi, and Zahra. Very interesting, 3 different perspectives. So my question is, we started with the word urban and then came down to, a micro scale where you spoke about the space in front of Hotel Metropole. Somewhere in these three, why are we not officially accepting that Mysore will become a metro or an urban when the scales of the metros change? You know, today what we call as big metropolitan cities, they are having a serious issue on horizontal growth, vertical growth.
Yes.
Going on layering ring roads and some other road. So a lot of people are now moving towards the next level, closer to these big towns, and Mysore is a classic example. So some planners, they said what we are going to do is we're going to draw a radius, and within that limit horizontal growth, put a moratorium, and go outside ring road and just go berserk and go 8 floors and whatnot. And a classic example is our Brigade Symphony, is one such thing. Such a massive development, and now a hotel is also coming up. No criticism, but they have not even considered what's going to happen to that road. Today, when a train passes and they close the gate, all the gates of this brigade are blocked. So such things are bound to happen, and slowly, when you look at the industries they created going defunct, so the obvious solution is such thing. What do the three panelists think would or should or will happen to Mysore? Thank you.
So just to take this on first, I will give Zara and Surabhi also a chance to talk, but my 2 cents on this is, yes, it is going to be unavoidable that Mysore is going to grow. One is the pressure on the city of Bangalore is so high, and this is another city which is in relatively close proximity. There are these rail routes and road routes which are getting better and better, saving time. So many people will probably consider, living in Mysore and working in Bangalore. That option is not too far off. Already some people are doing it, but soon that is going to happen. Now, this drawing the line and asking this one infrastructure to get higher and larger FSIs beyond a certain this one, I think does not make too much sense. Yes, like I think Zara showed in one of her presentations. Not Zara, it was someone else in today's landscape architecture, this one. The student or the speaker was talking about Paris, wherein there is a clear demarcation between the old city, which has got certain rules for the heritage town, and the newer developments. Okay, so this old city has to be smaller, and then the fairly large the newer developments can have revised FARs, so that we can look at a higher city happening, and the load or the stress on the infrastructure in terms of drainage systems and UGDs and other things can be lesser, because now the situation in Bangalore is such that heart of the city, because of these synchronized traffic signal lights and all that, is fairly decongested. The congestion and the problem is happening on the ring roads and the newer layouts, things like Marathalli and that bridge and all. That is where the the problem is now. So if they take the same approach in Mysore, we are going to create that. A professor of mine, I think you also know him, George Sir, he used to keep saying that world over, infrastructure comes first and then people start moving in. It's only in India that people move in and then only infrastructure comes. So if any planner or urban designers, we think of the development and the infrastructure is laid out first, and then we allow this planned sort of development to take place in terms of FARs and all that, that would be a better approach. I think, I don't know what Zara and Surabhi want to add to this. Please do add.
So, my perspective, yes, I do feel that Mysore one day will turn out to be a metropolitan city. But I do agree, like what you are saying, like the infrastructure has to come first. So, it is very similar to what I spoke. So the planning authorities or the planning, the urban planning master plan has to dictate as to how we are going to grow. So they are already doing it, I think, on a 20-year basis. But then this has to also start looking at how we can build as to how when the population increases, and also start looking at from which areas are these population going to be coming. We need to sort of start predicting that. And likewise, again, analysis can be done as to from which area these are coming, and then what are the areas that needs rapid development first, and then prioritize that and phase that out, instead of developing on the whole as a total ring on the outside.
Can I just, a very quick word, I'll leave it for others. I think we are a Mysore-based school of architecture. We have done this work. Today we are debating. Can we give a small proposal to the planning authorities through this UNCHS group? Because what you're suggesting is not the thought process happening with the corporation or MUDA or any of them. I think they are looking at it in terms of revenue and economy model and plotting and all that. I seriously think we must give, for whatever it's worth, we must give a proposal. I leave it to you how we can do that. But I seriously think, having done so much work, I think we must take it forward.
We
I
can
would
do
like
it.
to add up.
Yeah, come, Zara.
I would like to add up here, Mysore Urban Development Authority had actually put up a proposal around 2005 for the metro. But then what happened during that time was, it was there in certain articles and all, is we do not have enough passengers to actually use it. So first thing that they are asking, like the government has put it up in their gated notifications that it is going to come up, but what the people here are asking for is, are so many people going to use such services? First thing is, not many people are dependent on public services here. So first thing they wanted is to actually connect both the railways and the roadways properly at all the four edges of the city and actually have it. But then that got shelved down. The metro project got shelved down. So a lot of discussions happened, but then I don't think it has continued further on, after which I haven't read anything about the metro. But I do not.
Zara, I think you missed the point. We're not going to go back. Any proposals came, they set up a heritage laws or no. I'm only just saying, having done this 3 studies now and little more work that our students did, we as an institution must not look back. We must, now we know what Mysore is, and say we want to protect it for the next 15 years or 20 years. So do this. And people have come up and given proposals. Because we are an institution, we will be heard. That was my point. I'm not saying what happened or who discussed or debated.
Okay, sir. Thank you for your insights on that. If anyone else has anything to ask, we are ready to take it on. Otherwise, Balaji and Kayal, both of you have thanked us for it. It was a pleasure doing it, and we will look forward to having much more sessions like this from faculties as well as students of Mysore School of Architecture. It was a pleasure. And I would like to thank Professor Mahant and Professor Sandeep for having initiated this sort of a thing, and doing such a meticulous job of coordinating these the speakers. We are all working remotely, but they have coordinated this very well. Thank you, all the audience, for your patient listening. One last time, we still ask if there is a question, we're ready to take it. Otherwise, we can disperse. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you for being with us. You have our mails. If you still have anything to clarify, anything to say, please feel free to write to us. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.